In every city, there are crimes that change everything. Crimes that divide time into before and after. Crimes that make people lock their doors, check their windows, look over their shoulders. This is the story of one of those crimes. And the man who committed it lived among the people of Wichita for 31 years, watching them fear him, reading about himself in the newspaper, attending the same churches and schools as his victims' families, walking free until the day his own ego destroyed him. Prologue, January 15th, 1974. It's a Tuesday afternoon in Wichita, Kansas. The kind of cold, gray winter day that makes you grateful to come home from school to a warm house. 15-year-old Charlie Otero is walking home with his siblings Carmen, 13, and Danny, 14. They'd left for school that morning like any other day. Their father, Joseph, had taken the older 3 kids to school first. They started earlier than the younger ones. Then he was supposed to come back and take Joey, 9, and Josephine, 11, to their school, which started later. As Charlie opens the front door to 803 North Edgemore Street, something feels wrong. The house is too quiet. Their dog, usually barking, always greeting them, is silent. "Hello?" Charlie calls out. "Anyone home?" No answer. He walks toward his parents' bedroom, that feeling of dread growing with each step. And then he sees his father. Joseph Otero, 38 years old, is lying face down on the floor at the foot of the bed. His hands are bound behind his back with cord. His ankles are tied together. He's not moving. Charlie backs away, his mind refusing to process what he's seeing. He goes to find his mother. Julie Otero, 34, is in the bedroom too, also bound, also not moving. Carmen starts screaming. Charlie runs through the house looking for his younger siblings. He finds Joey's body in his bedroom. The 9-year-old has been strangled. And then, in the basement, he finds Josephine. His 11-year-old sister is hanging from a sewer pipe, a cord around her neck. All 4 of them dead. The Otero children run to a neighbor's house, hysterical, barely able to explain what they found. The neighbor calls the police. The crime scene. When Wichita Police Department officers arrive at 803 North Edgemore, they find a scene unlike anything they've encountered before. This isn't a robbery gone wrong. Nothing of significant value has been taken, just Joseph Otero's watch and some items from Julie's purse. The house isn't ransacked. This isn't a crime of passion. The killer didn't know the family. There's no evidence of any prior connection. This is something else entirely. All 4 victims were bound with cord cut from Venetian blind material, but there were no blinds like that in the house. The killer had brought his own supplies. He came prepared. The phone line had been cut from outside, and there's semen throughout the house. The killer masturbated at the scene, though none of the victims were sexually assaulted in the traditional sense. Police Chief Floyd Hannon tells reporters, The way in which family members were slain indicates a fetish on the part of the assailant. The murders appear to have occurred around 8 or 9 a.m. after Joseph dropped off the older children, but before he could take the younger ones to school. Neighbors report seeing a man leaving the Otero home in the family's car around mid-morning, possibly dark comp, Lexion. That's all they can remember. The car was found abandoned in a nearby grocery store parking lot. Who were the Oteros? Joseph Otero was a retired Air Force sergeant. He'd served his country for over 20 years before moving his family to Wichita from Puerto Rico just months earlier. He was looking forward to civilian life, to watch his children grow up in a safe community. Julie Otero was a homemaker and mother of 5. She'd worked briefly at the Coleman Company, a local camping equipment manufacturer, but had stopped to focus on raising the children. The family practiced judo together. All of them, including the children, were trained in self-defense. They were physically capable, alert, the kind of family that shouldn't have been easy targets. And yet someone had subdued all 4 of them, had bound them systematically, had killed them one by one. Police theorized the killer entered the house while Julie and the 2 younger children were alone, subdued and bound them, then waited for Joseph to return and ambushed him. But who and why this family? The investigation begins. Wichita police launch a massive investigation. They interview neighbors, co-workers, anyone who'd had contact with the Otero family. They find nothing. No enemies, no debts, no reason anyone would want them dead. They collect forensic evidence, the semen, the cords, fingerprints, but it's 1974. DNA profiling doesn't exist yet. The evidence is carefully preserved, documented, and filed away, waiting for technology to catch up. Weeks pass, then months. The case grows cold. And then, on April 4th, 1974, less than 3 months after the Otero murders, someone breaks into the home of 21-year-old Catherine Bright. Part 1. The Killer Strikes Again. April 4th, 1974. Catherine Bright works at the Coleman Company, the same place Julie Otero had worked before she died. On the afternoon of April 4th, Catherine and her 19-year-old brother Kevin arrive home to find an intruder waiting inside. The man has a gun. He tells them he's a wanted criminal. He needs money and a car to get to New York. Just cooperate and no one gets hurt. It's the same story he told the Oteros. He forces Kevin to tie up Catherine, then takes Kevin to another room and tries to strangle him with cord. But Kevin fights back. The 2 men struggle violently. The gun goes off. Kevin is shot twice in the head, but somehow, impossibly survives. He manages to escape the house and get help. Behind him, the killer turns his rage on Catherine. He stabs her multiple times and strangles her. Then he flees. Catherine Bright dies. Kevin Bright lives, but with severe injuries and trauma. The police have a survivor now, a witness. But Kevin's description is frustratingly vague. White male, late 20s to early 30s, average height and build, dark hair. It could be thousands of men in Wichita. Initially, investigators aren't sure this murder is connected to the Oteros. The MO is different. It's messier, more chaotic. The Otero murders were controlled, systematic. This was improvised violence. Only later will they learn that Catherine Bright was indeed killed by the same person, because in October 1974 that person is going to tell them so himself. Part 2. BTK announces himself. October 22nd, 1974, the Wichita Eagle receives a phone call. A man's voice directs them to go to the Wichita Public Library, second floor, engineering section. Look inside a specific mechanical engineering textbook. A reporter follows the instructions. Inside the book, hidden between pages, is a letter. The letter is poorly written, full of misspellings and grammatical errors, but the content is chilling. The writer claims responsibility for the Otero murders. He provides details that were never made public, details only the killer would know. The position of the bodies, the cords used, specific items taken. And then he writes, "It's hard to control myself. You probably call me psychotic with sexual perversion hang up. When this monster enter my brain, I will never know. But it here to stay. How does one cure himself? I can't stop it, so the monster goes on and hurts me as well as society. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK, BTK. Bind, torture, kill. The killer has given himself a name, and he's made it clear he's going to kill again. Panic in Wichita. The publication of this letter changes everything. Until now, Wichita residents could tell themselves the Otero murders were an isolated incident. Horrible, yes, but overdone, not something that would happen again. Now they know better. There's a serial killer in their city, someone who plans his attacks, someone who gets sexual gratification from binding and strangling his victims, someone who wants attention for what he's done. The Wichita Eagle runs stories, television news picks it up. Fear spreads through the community. Hardware stores sell out of locks and security chains. People who've never owned guns buy them. Parents walk their children to and from school. Women who live alone double-check their windows at night. The police set up a special task force. They increase patrols. They investigate every lead, no matter how thin. But they have nothing solid. The letter was wiped clean of fingerprints. Handwriting analysis is inconclusive. They're back to square one. 3 months pass, 6 months, a year. No new murders, no new letters. Maybe BTK is done. Maybe he's moved away. Maybe he's dead. But in March 1977 he returns. Part 3, 1977. The terror intensifies. March 17th, 1977. Shirley Vian, 26 years old, is home with her 3 young children when someone knocks on her door. She answers. The man at the door forces his way inside. He has a gun. He tells her he has a sexual problem and needs to tie her up. It's a bizarre, transparent excuse, but Shirley has 3 small children in the house. She's terrified of what he might do to them. The intruder locks the children in the bathroom. He tells them to stay there, to be quiet, that their mother will be fine. Then he binds Shirley Vian with cords and strangles her with a rope, placing a plastic bag over her head. The children hear sounds of struggle. They hear their mother's last moments, but they stay in the bathroom, too frightened to come out. When it's over, the killer leaves. The children eventually emerge to find their mother dead. It's been 3 years since the Otero murders. Wichita had started to relax, and now BTK, because they're sure this is BTK, has struck again. December 8th, 1977, Nancy Fox. Nancy Fox, 25, lives alone in her Wichita apartment. She works at Hellsberg Diamonds jewelry store in downtown Wichita. On the night of December 8th, she comes home from work around 9:30 p.m. She doesn't know someone has broken in through her back door and is waiting inside. The intruder confronts her. He ties her up with her own clothing and strangles her with a belt. And then, after he leaves, he does something new. He calls the police from a payphone. The call is recorded. Dispatcher, emergency. Caller, yes, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Fox. Dispatcher, I'm sorry sir, I can't understand you. What is the address? Caller, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing. Dispatcher, 843 South. The caller hangs up. Police respond to the address and find Nancy Fox's body exactly where the caller said it would be. The voice recording is played on television, hoping someone will recognize it. The Wichita police receive hundreds of tips. None lead anywhere. BTK has now killed 7 people that they know of: the Oteros, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox. And he's getting bolder, calling the police directly, practically daring them to catch him. The letters continue. In January 1978, shortly after Nancy Fox's murder, BTK sends a poem to the Wichita Eagle. It's titled Shirley Locks, a sick play on a nursery rhyme, and it describes Shirley Vian's murder in crude verse. Then, in February 1978, he sends a letter to Cake TV, a local television station. In it, he takes credit for multiple murders and provides more details. He demands media attention. How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention? He's escalating. The murders are bad enough, but the taunting letters make it worse. He's playing with them, enjoying this. And then, silence. Part 4. The Years of Silence. 1979 to 2004. Where did he go? After the February 1978 letter, BTK goes quiet. No murders, no letters, no contact. Months pass, then a year, then 2 years, then 5. The BTK task force continues working the case, but leads dry up. The investigation stalls. Officers retire or transfer to other assignments. By the early 1980s, many in law enforcement believe BTK is either dead, imprisoned for another crime, institutionalized, or has moved away from Wichita. The public slowly relaxes. Children grow up having never lived through the terror of the 1970s. New residents move to Wichita with no knowledge of BTK. By the 1990s, BTK has become local legend, the boogeyman parents mention to make sure kids lock the doors. A cautionary tale, history. But in reality, BTK never left Wichita. He's still there, living a normal life, working, raising a family, attending church. And in 1985, after 8 years of silence, he kills again. April 27th, 1985. Maureen Hedge. Maureen Hedge, 53 years old, is strangled in her home in Park City, just north of Wichita. The killer moves her body. He puts it in her own car, drives to a remote location, and photographs her corpse in various posed positions. Then he dumps the body. Maureen Hedge's body is eventually found, but the case isn't immediately connected to BTK. It's been too long. The MO is different. The body was moved. Only years later, after BTK is caught, will investigators learn this was his 8th victim. September 16, 1986. Vicky Weigel. Vicky Weigel, 28, is a mother of 2. She's home alone with her 2-year-old son when someone knocks on her door. The man at the door is wearing a telephone repairman's uniform. Vicky, believing he's legitimate, lets him in. Once inside, he attacks. He ties her up and strangles her with pantyhose. Her toddler son witnesses his mother's murder. Like Maureen Hedge, this case isn't initially connected to BTK. It remains unsolved for years. January 19, 1991, Dolores Davis. Dolores Davis, 62, lives in a secluded home in Park City. She's strangled in her home. Then her body is transported and dumped under a bridge, where it's discovered on February 1st by a teenager whose dog ran under the bridge. Again, not immediately connected to BTK. And after Dolores Davis, the killing stops. For 13 years there are no more BTK murders. The case is considered one of the coldest of cold cases. Most of the original investigators have retired. The task force has been disbanded. The evidence sits in storage. By 2004, BTK is ancient history. And that's when he decides to remind everyone that he still exists. Part 5. The Killer Returns. January 2004, the 30th anniversary. On January 15th, 2004, exactly 30 years after the Otero murders, the Wichita Eagle runs a feature article. The headline, BTK Case Unsolved 30 Years Later. The article recounts the terror of the 1970s. It interviews victims' families. It speculates about what happened to BTK. Is he dead, in prison? Did he move away? Someone is reading this article very carefully, and he's offended. March 2004. He's back. In March 2004, the Wichita Eagle receives an envelope. Inside is a photocopy of Vicky Weigel's driver's license, the one stolen from her body in 1986, and photographs from her crime scene. The message is clear. Vicky Weigel was a BTK victim, and BTK is still alive. Panic returns to Wichita. The killer who terrorized the city in the 1970s is back, and if he's back, will he kill again? The police reconstitute the BTK task force. Lieutenant Ken Lundver, head of Wichita PD's homicide unit, takes the lead. They develop a strategy. Keep him talking. The more he communicates, the more likely he'll make a mistake. The communications flood. Over the following months, BTK sends a flurry of packages and letters to police and media, word puzzles and cryptograms, chapters of an autobiography, dolls bound to mimic his victims, drawings of women in bondage, jewelry and items taken from victims, detailed descriptions of his crimes. He's prolific, energized, clearly enjoying the attention after years of being forgotten. He uses cereal boxes to package items, possibly a pun on serial killer. Police analyze every communication, looking for clues, handwriting, paper type, where items were purchased, anything that might lead to him. But he's careful. He wipes things clean. He uses generic materials. He leaves packages in public places where security cameras don't reach. Still, they're learning things. He's local. He knows Wichita intimately. He's been here the whole time. He references local news and events. He's obsessed with attention. He wants to be studied, discussed, remembered. He's getting older. Some communications reference aging, losing physical capabilities, and then in January 2005 he makes his first real mistake. Part 6. The floppy disk. January 2005. The question. In one of his communications, BTK asks police a question. Can I communicate with floppy and not be traced to a computer? Be honest. He wants to send them information on a floppy disk, but he's worried. Can they trace a floppy disk back to a specific computer? The police have a crucial decision to make. If they tell the truth, yes, we can trace it, BTK will never send the disk. He'll continue using untraceable methods. They'll learn nothing new. But if they lie, they choose to lie. Through a classified ad in the Wichita Eagle, exactly as BTK instructed, they place a message. Rex, it will be okay. Rex was one of the code names BTK had suggested for himself in his communications. The message is simple. Yes, it's safe. Send the disk. BTK believes them. February 16th, 2005. A package arrives at KSAS TV, a local television station. Inside is a purple 1.44 MB Memorex floppy disk, a letter, a gold necklace, a photocopy of a book cover. The station immediately contacts police. Lieutenant Ken Landwehr and computer forensic examiner Randy Stone examine the disk. There's one visible file, tester.tf, a Microsoft Word document with typical BTK taunts. But Randy Stone knows that deleted files don't truly disappear from floppy disks immediately. The data remains until it's overwritten. He recovers deleted files. One of them contains metadata, data about data, information about who created the file, when, and on what computer. The metadata reads, last modified by Dennis, document created at Christ Lutheran Church, Wichita. That's it. That's the break. Dennis, Christ Lutheran Church. The investigation narrows. It takes police less than a week to identify a suspect. Christ Lutheran Church has a congregation council president named Dennis Rader. He's 59 years old, married with 2 adult children, works as a compliance officer for Park City, essentially a code enforcement officer who writes tickets for grass that's too tall and dogs running loose. He's been a member of Christ Lutheran Church for decades, active in various church committees, well respected. On the surface, he's the last person anyone would suspect. But surveillance confirms he owns a black Jeep Cherokee, the same vehicle seen on security footage dropping off earlier BTK packages. Now they need proof. They need DNA. The DNA trap. Police know they have BTK's DNA from crime scenes, semen from the Otero murders, DNA evidence from other scenes. But they don't have Dennis Rader's DNA to compare it to. Getting a warrant for his DNA would alert him that he's a suspect. They need to be subtle, so they get creative. Rader's daughter, Kerry, attended Kansas State University. Like many college students, she'd had medical procedures done at the University Health Center, including a routine pap smear. With proper warrants, police obtained tissue samples from that pap smear. They run a familial DNA test, comparing the DNA from BTK's crime scenes to Kerry's DNA. The results come back, familial match. The DNA from BTK's crime scenes belongs to someone closely related to Kerry Rader, which means Dennis Rader is BTK. Part 7. The Arrest. February 25th, 2005, 12 o'clock noon. Dennis Rader is driving home from work during his lunch break from his job as Park City Compliance Officer, where he writes tickets and enforces city codes. At precisely noon, police cars surround his vehicle. Officers approach with guns drawn. "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" Dennis Rader looks at them calmly. He seems almost relieved. "Oh, I have suspicions why." He's arrested without resistance. No drama, no chase. He simply goes with them. The interrogation. At the police station, Rader asks the question that's been burning in his mind. "I need to ask you, how come you lied to me? How come you lied to me about the floppy disk?" Detective Lieutenant Ken Landwehr looks at him evenly. "Because I was trying to catch you." Rader can't let it go. He keeps returning to it during the interrogation. He's genuinely hurt, offended. "You lied to me," he says, his voice full of betrayal. "You told me it was safe." For 30 years, this has been a game to him, a contest. He thought there were rules. He thought police would play fair. The idea that they would deceive him, would break the unspoken rules of their cat-and-mouse game, genuinely shocks him. "The floppy did me in," he finally admits. And then, over the next 32 hours, Dennis Rader confesses to everything. Part 8. The Confession. February 25th, 2005, 32 hours. Dennis Rader's confession lasts 32 hours over several days. And it's chilling. Not because of the emotions he displays, he shows almost none, but because of how matter-of-fact he is. He describes each murder in detail, how he planned it, how he chose his victims, what he did to them, how it made him feel. He uses clinical language as if describing a science experiment. "I put a bag over his head. I strangled him until he stopped moving. I took her down to the basement. I hung her from the pipe." He talks about his fantasies, his projects, his term for stalking potential victims, his masturbation at crime scenes, his photography of victims' bodies. He admits to additional crimes: the Marine Hedge murder in 1985, not previously connected to BTK, the Vicky Weigel murder in 1986, solved only after his letter in 2004, the Dolores Davis murder in 1991, his last known victim, numerous burglaries, breaking into homes to steal underwear and take photographs, attempted kidnappings, and stalking incidents that didn't result in murders. He provides details about victims that only the killer would know. He corrects investigators when they get minor details wrong about his crimes, as if offended that they haven't studied his work thoroughly enough. The factor of BTK is that I have a lot of them out there that are my potential victims, he explains, using third person occasionally as if BTK is separate from Dennis Rader. He describes his trolling activities, driving through neighborhoods looking for potential victims, following women home from stores, breaking into houses to get familiar with layouts. I actually had many victims I stalked, he says. They're really quite lucky. The compartmentalization. What emerges from the interrogation is a picture of extreme compartmentalization. Dennis Rader describes himself as having two identities. Dennis Rader, the compliance officer, church council president, husband, father, Boy Scout leader, a rule follower who measured grass heights with rulers and wrote citations for minor code violations. BTK, the monster, the fantasy self who bound, tortured, and killed, the one who took control, who exercised ultimate power over helpless victims. Rader explains that he kept these identities rigidly separated. BTK existed in a locked drawer in his office at City Hall. BTK existed in secret photo sessions in the basement. BTK existed in fantasies and trolling sessions. But when he was at work at church with his family, BTK was locked away. I've done a pretty good job separating the two, he tells investigators with something approaching pride. He describes his cooling off periods as times when Dennis was in control, when family obligations, work stress, or fear of capture kept BTK contained. But the urges never went away, they just waited. It's like a demon, he says. You can control the demon somewhat, but you can't destroy it. You can't kill the demon. Why did he start communicating again? Investigators ask the obvious question. Why did you start sending letters again in 2004 after 13 years of silence? Rader's answer is revealing. I was jealous of other serial killers getting so much media attention. I felt like I was being forgotten. He mentions the BTK 30th anniversary article specifically, reading that people had moved on, that younger residents didn't know who BTK was, that he was considered ancient history. It bothered him immensely. I guess you could call it my comeback, he says. He wanted recognition, fame, to be studied and discussed, to have his work appreciated. The irony, which Rader doesn't seem to grasp, is that by seeking that attention, he got himself caught. If he'd stayed quiet, he'd still be free today. The case was cold. Technology had advanced, but without new evidence to apply it to, it didn't matter. The statute of limitations didn't apply to murder, but without fresh leads, the investigation was effectively dead. But Dennis Rader couldn't help himself. His ego demanded satisfaction, and his ego destroyed him. Part 9. The Trial. June 27th, August 18th, 2005. Dennis Rader's trial begins on June 27th, 2005. But there's no suspense. Rader has already confessed to everything in excruciating detail. His guilt is not in question. The trial is essentially a formality, a chance for the victims' families to hear the full story, for the public to understand what happened, and for the court to impose sentence. Rader pleads guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. Joseph Otero, Julie Otero, Joseph Otero Jr., Josephine Otero, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wiegler, Dolores Davis. The proceedings are televised. Millions watch as Dennis Rader, this bland, ordinary-looking middle-aged man in glasses, calmly describes his murders. Judge Gregory Waller asks Rader to provide details of each crime to establish the factual basis for his guilty pleas. And Rader complies, enthusiastically. He speaks for hours. He uses visual aids, hand gestures to demonstrate how he strangled victims, how he tied knots, how he positioned bodies. He draws diagrams. He corrects himself when he gets minor details wrong, as if accuracy in describing his murders is a point of professional pride. At one point, describing Josephine Otero's murder, he says, "I hung her. That's about the end of that story." His tone is conversational, almost casual, as if he's describing a home improvement project rather than the murder of an 11-year-old girl. The victims' families sit in the courtroom, forced to listen to these descriptions. Some cry, some stare at Rader with hatred, some simply look numb, overwhelmed by the horror. Rader occasionally glances at them, but he shows no remorse, no empathy, no understanding that these were real people he destroyed, real families whose lives he shattered. The families speak. During the sentencing phase, victims' families are given the opportunity to make impact statements. Steve Relford, whose sister Nancy Fox was murdered, tells Rader, "I speak for every family member here and every decent human being. You are in a class by yourself. That class is evil." Beverly Plapp, Maureen Hedges' cousin, says, "You do not get to know what we feel. You have a normal, everyday expression, and you don't care. You are cold, calculating, and very evil." Charlie Otero, who'd been 15 when his parents and siblings were murdered, delivers perhaps the most powerful statement. "My dad put up a good fight. You had to use all your might and all the demon's might to kill him. You are a coward. You are the worst of the worst." Carmen Otero, another sibling who'd been at school when her family was killed, says through tears, "You have no control over me anymore." Throughout these statements, Rader sits motionless, occasionally adjusting his glasses. He appears to be listening but shows no visible emotional response. Some family members notice that he seems almost pleased, as if hearing how much pain he caused satisfies some need in him. The sentence. Kansas had abolished the death penalty in 1972 and didn't reinstate it until 1994, after Rader's last known murder in 1991. This means he's not eligible for execution. On August 18, 2005, Judge Waller sentences Dennis Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences, a minimum of 175 years, without possibility of parole. Your actions were selfishly brutal, and you made no attempt to honor human life, the judge says. Rader is led away in handcuffs. He shows no emotion. He'll never be free again. He'll die in prison. And that will be the end of the story, except for one more chapter that needs to be told. Part 10. The Aftermath. Paula Rader, Dennis Rader's wife Paula, filed for divorce immediately after his arrest. The divorce was finalized in July 2005, just before his sentencing. Paula gave a statement to the press through her attorney. "I have read the public notices of the criminal case. The court has made public only a few selected facts from the life of Dennis Rader. I live in the same community where these hideous crimes were committed. My life and the lives of my family members will never be the same." She never remarried. She never gave interviews. She withdrew from public life completely. Imagine her position, married to this man for 34 years, had children with him, slept next to him every night, went to church with him, believed he was a good man, and discovering that he'd been a serial killer the entire time, that he'd murdered people, including their neighbor Marine Hedge, while maintaining this facade of normality. Did she really not know? Or did she choose not to see? Investigators believe she genuinely had no idea. Rader was careful. He compartmentalized. He kept his two lives completely separate. But Paula Rader lived the rest of her life knowing she'd been married to a monster and never suspected a thing. She died in 2023, taking whatever knowledge or suspicions she'd had to her grave. The children, Kerry and Brian Rader, were 26 and 23 years old respectively when their father was arrested. Both have struggled with the revelation of who their father really was. Kerry Rader, now Kerry Rawson after her marriage, eventually wrote a book, A Serial Killer's Daughter, My Story of Faith, Love, and Overcoming. In it, she describes the shock of learning her father was BTK, the disbelief, the denial, the slow, horrible acceptance. She talks about the good memories, her father teaching her to ride a bike, helping with homework, attending her school events, and the cognitive dissonance of reconciling those memories with the knowledge of what he was doing during those same years. She describes visiting him in prison once, years after his arrest, and asking him, "Did you ever think about killing us?" His answer, "I never thought of you in that way," which wasn't quite a no. Kerry and Brian both changed their last names and tried to rebuild their lives away from the shadow of BTK. But it never really leaves you, does it? Knowing your father is a serial killer, knowing his DNA is half of yours, knowing that when people Google your name, it's him they find. The victims' families. For the families of Rader's victims, his arrest brought a mix of relief and renewed trauma. Relief that he'd finally been caught, that justice, such as it was, had been served, but renewed trauma because now they had to relive everything. The trials meant hearing detailed descriptions of how their loved ones died. Media coverage meant seeing Rader's face everywhere, hearing his voice, watching him calmly describe murders as if discussing the weather. Charlie Otero, who'd lost his father, mother, and 2 younger siblings, said, "For years I wondered what kind of monster could do this. And then I saw him, and he looked so normal. That's what scared me most, that evil can look so ordinary." Some family members attended every court hearing. Others couldn't bear to be in the same room with Rader. Several moved away from Wichita, unable to continue living in the city where their loved ones had been murdered. The trauma ripples outward. Siblings who lost siblings, children who lost parents, grandchildren who never got to meet their grandparents because a man needed to satisfy his sexual fantasies. Wichita today. The city of Wichita has never quite forgotten BTK. The Otero home at 803 North Edgemore was eventually demolished. The lot sat empty for years. It's now been rebuilt, but longtime residents still refer to it as the BTK house. Several other crime scene locations have been demolished or heavily renovated. Christ Lutheran Church continues to operate, though Pastor Michael Clark, who'd praised Rader as a wonderful member, retired not long after the arrest. The church underwent a period of soul-searching. How could they have had a serial killer as council president and not noticed? What did that say about them? Park City fired Dennis Rader, obviously, and had to deal with the unsettling fact that their compliance officer, the man who enforced rules and regulations, had been a serial killer. Citizens who'd received citations from him wondered, what if I'd argued with him more forcefully? What if I'd made him angry? The BTK case changed how Wichita thinks about itself. For decades it was known as a safe, boring Midwestern city where nothing much happened. Now it's forever linked to one of America's most infamous serial killers. Tour companies offer BTK tours, a grotesque commercialization of tragedy that some victims' families have protested. But the case also served as a cautionary tale for law enforcement nationwide. The floppy disk mistake became a training example in how criminals can be undone by their ignorance of technology. The successful use of familial DNA helped establish that technique as a legitimate investigative tool. Part 11. Prison Life. El Dorado Correctional Facility. Dennis Rader is currently housed at El Dorado Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in Kansas. He's in protective custody, not because authorities fear for his safety particularly, but because his notoriety makes him a target and a potential security risk. He's allowed limited privileges, reading materials, television, though restricted, correspondence heavily monitored, and occasional visits from family, though his children rarely visit. Reports from prison staff describe Rader as a model prisoner, polite, rule-following, compliant, which makes sense given his personality. He's always been someone who follows institutional rules while harboring a secret monster inside. He receives fan mail, yes, fan mail, The phenomenon of serial killer groupies is well documented, and Rader is no exception. He occasionally responds to these letters, though prison officials monitor all his correspondence. In some letters, he continues to brag about his crimes, to relish the attention, to position himself as an important figure in serial killer history. In 2006, Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist and professor, interviewed Rader extensively for her book, Confession of a Serial Killer: The Untold Story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer. During these interviews, Rader was forthcoming, perhaps too forthcoming, about his fantasies, his methods, his psychology. He seemed to enjoy having someone study him, take him seriously as a subject of academic interest. He talked about how he'd like to write a book himself, the BTK story. He thought it would sell well. He didn't seem to understand or care that profiting from his crimes would be morally repugnant and legally prohibited under Son of Sam laws. Does he have remorse? The short answer: no, not really. Rader sometimes expresses what sounds like remorse in letters and interviews. I deeply regret what I did. I wish I could take it back. I know I hurt a lot of people. But forensic psychologists who've evaluated him say this isn't genuine remorse. It's what he thinks he's supposed to say. It's performative, another role he's playing. Real remorse involves empathy, understanding and feeling the pain you've caused others. By all accounts, Rader lacks this capacity. When he says he regrets his crimes, what he really regrets is getting caught. He regrets losing his freedom, his family, his position in the community. He regrets that his work is now viewed negatively instead of with the admiration he believes it deserves. But he doesn't seem to genuinely feel pain for what his victims experienced. He doesn't cry for Josephine Otero hanged in her own basement. He doesn't grieve for the families he destroyed. He cries for himself. Epilogue: The Monster Next Door. The story of Dennis Rader forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always look like evil. We want monsters to look monstrous. We want serial killers to be obvious. Disturbed loners living in isolated cabins, clearly mentally ill, visibly wrong somehow. But Dennis Rader was none of those things. He was married for 34 years. He raised 2 children who loved him. He held steady jobs. He was active in his church, not just attending, but leading. He volunteered with Boy Scouts. He followed rules. He helped neighbors with home repairs. He measured grass heights and wrote parking tickets. People who knew him described him as boring, annoying sometimes with his rigid adherence to regulations, but harmless. He was the last person I would have suspected, said virtually everyone who knew him after his arrest. And that's what makes BTK so terrifying, not the murders themselves, horrible as they were, but the ordinariness of the man who committed them. If Dennis Rader could be BTK, who else might be hiding in plain sight? The role of ego. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the BTK case is how Rader's own ego destroyed him. He had gotten away with it. 10 murders over 17 years and not one solid lead pointing to him. The case was cold. Technology had advanced, but without new evidence or communications, it didn't help. If Raider had simply stayed quiet, he'd still be free today. He'd be retired now, 79 years old, living out his remaining years as a respected former church leader and city official. But he couldn't. His need for recognition, his desperate desire to be remembered, studied, admired for his work, drove him to resume contact with police and media in 2004. And that decision led directly to his capture. The floppy disk was just the mechanism, but the real mistake was believing that his ego could be satisfied, that he could control the narrative, that he was smarter than everyone else. The floppy did me in, he admitted in his interrogation. But really, it was his own arrogance that did him in. The floppy disk was just the tool. Dennis Rader will die in prison, that much is certain. But is this justice? For the victims' families, seeing Rader led away in handcuffs brought relief but not closure. How can there be closure when your loved one is gone forever? When you've had to hear detailed descriptions of their final moments? When the person who did this to them is still alive, still breathing, still capable of writing letters and watching television and receiving fan mail? Some families advocate for the death penalty, believing Rader deserves execution for his crimes. But Kansas law prohibits applying capital punishment retroactively, and Rader's crimes fall outside the current death penalty statute. So he lives in a cell for the rest of his natural life. It's something, but it's not enough. It can never be enough. Dennis Rader will be remembered as BTK, bind, torture, kill, one of America's most notorious serial killers. The BTK case reminds us to be vigilant, not paranoid. Most people are good, or at least not homicidal, but aware. The friendly neighbor might not be what they seem. The helpful church member might be hiding darkness. The rule-following compliance officer might be breaking the most fundamental laws of all. Evil wears masks, sometimes very convincing ones. Trust but verify. Be aware of your surroundings. Lock your doors and windows. If something feels wrong, listen to that instinct. And remember, Dennis Rader killed 10 people over 17 years while living a completely normal life. He was caught not through brilliant detective work, though the investigation was thorough, but because his own ego made him reach out and communicate. Which means there might be others out there, others who are smarter, others who can control their urge to seek attention. Others who will never be caught because they learned from BTK's mistakes. Sleep well, if you can. But maybe check the locks first.